What's up, YouTube? And welcome to the first episode of my new series called Let's Read. Today we're going to take a look at the full set of an obscure magazine from the 1990s called Game On USA. This magazine was primarily from the 1996 era, and if I had to guess, had pretty minor distribution, probably mostly centered on the West Coast as it was a California publication. It is very heavy on Japanese games, which I definitely am a big fan of. I was not even aware that this magazine existed in period. If I was, I probably would have picked up at least a couple of these issues on the newsstand, so it may not have even had full USA distribution. The one thing that really makes this magazine unique is that it is heavily devoted to manga. It has almost half, if not more, of each issue is video game related comics. So they pretty much would take Japanese manga based on video games, translate it into English, and then offer it as a serial that would run through multiple issues of the magazine. Overall, the set only lasted the full 7 issues that you see here, and it is kind of sad that it wasn't able to maybe reach its full potential, as I could tell they were trying to make adjustments along the way. So what I would like to do is kind of walk you through some specific pages of these that I thought were interesting, maybe call out some things that made this magazine unique, especially in the market even compared to other hardcore gamer magazines like Game Fan of the era. So I'll walk you through the full set of the 7 issues. We'll start with issue 1, and this one has a cover with Cami from Street Fighter on it. Cami plays very heavily into these magazines, is the bulk of the mangas that is featured within them is starring Cami as well. So I do think that one thing that really set this magazine apart is just having Japanese-style animated, covers for the magazine covers versus like game screenshots or just character art that you would typically see on a game magazine of the era. Overall, the magazines are pretty thin. 1996 was a weird year in the industry, where if you really think about what was going on, 95 was probably the peak of the remainder of the 16-bit classics coming out, and then also all the new 32-bit systems hitting the market at the same time. 96 was more of a transitionary year. The 16-bit systems were dying out, and then some of the newer systems like the N64 had yet to launch. So really, if you look at game magazines from 1996, they tend to be a little thinner than the prior year or the year after, and maybe that's one of the factors that hurt this magazine, was coming out in that volatile environment that was really happening during the time. So we're going to go through some of the pages on here. I'm try to make sure I can set this in a way that you guys can see some of the key things. First thing I would call out is just the letter from the editor. Each issue would kick off with that. This one does set the tone by saying that the magazine was based on its relationship with Game On magazine in Japan, and this was a publication of Viz Communications, which really handled a lot of the publishing of anime released in the US on VHS during the time, and also manga. So it was a good fit, I guess, within that universe that they thought this magazine would be successful. So every issue, again, kicks off with that letter. The first one here is from a different editor, and I think it's the editor of the Japanese magazine that was just kind of kicking off the universe that was starting here. So we'll go through a few other pages. One thing I think is neat about every issue is they tend to have an interview with a game developer or gaming magnate, if you will, included in every issue. And typically they were very heavily on Japanese developers, so I thought that was really cool. The first issue has an interview with one of Capcom's R&D members, so really just talking about the Street Fighter universe and some of the things that were coming during this time for new games. Overall, pretty short interviews. They're not like super in-depth, but I think they're easily digestible. So then just some other things that are kind of unique about the magazine is just gaming-related news. They would cover a lot of things that are going on, in the industry. And I do think it's neat that they also covered arcade games, including some pretty unique things that we wouldn't read about a lot in typical game magazines of the era. So this one has things about Psychic Force and Dead or Alive when they were still at the arcade level before they became console releases. You also get things like a top 10 list of Japanese selling games, and you can kind of see, how things related to the U.S. market. A few of the U.S. magazines included that stuff in the same time, but they seem to go a little bit more in depth with like actually telling you a little bit about the games versus just giving you a list of the titles. So if you were wondering what a Meisner G game was all about, it would at least explain that too. So then we really get into the meat and potatoes of the magazine, which is the comics. And this is what really makes the magazine unique. Like I said, there is a story on Cami that ran throughout the bulk of the issues. And overall, you get maybe 15 pages or so of the Cami manga that runs throughout the issue. Obviously, it's fully translated into English, so that would be the big draw and why you would want to get it this way. There's no color, unfortunately. They are all in black and white, so it obviously preserves the original design. But, you know, I'm not a huge manga collector, so while I found these interesting, it's not something I probably would have bought as a standalone. But maybe that's one thing that they were hoping is it would bring in, you know, typical game magazine buyers into this universe. So I definitely can respect the intent here, what they were trying to do. So each issue has 2 serials that run through it. Like I said, the first one is obviously about Cami, and then the other one you'll see very commonly these issues is a Samurai Showdown series. Heavily features Haomaru, and then you'll see some of the other characters from that universe pop up throughout the storyline. But really nice art in these. You know, again, it's so much of the magazine is the comics. So given your interest in this, that's probably going to determine how much you really like this magazine overall. So I'll just show you a couple other pages of that, and we'll kind of go to my next flag here. So another thing I just want to call out is how minimal the advertising is in this magazine. And honestly, they were bragging about it in the editor letter at the beginning. It's just like, we don't need to advertise. We're Viz Communications. We've got lots of capital. You're not going to see a lot of ads. But when you did, it was typically things like this. Common ads you would see in like a game van as well, just import-centric game retailers. A lot of this, you know, people that imported games back then, it was done over the phone, so this was kind of at the early days of internet, and they obviously did have email that you could order games through email, but maybe not so much websites as we see today. There are a few reviews in the end of the magazine in each issue. They don't go too in-depth. There's no number system in this, which, again, like, I'm okay with that, but I think back in the day, to be competitive, people wanted to know, like, well, what's the score? Is it a 4 out of 5? Is it an 89%? Like, that's what I need to know to be able to buy the game. Obviously, that's easy mode and how you're choosing what to purchase, but I think, you know, again, that's kind of what the market demanded in the mid-90s. But if you see, they did cover some pretty unique titles. You have, like, a full review on Gunbird here, which is pretty cool, for the Sega Saturn when that came out in Japan, as well as some fighters and things like that of the era. So, kind of neat that they did that. The other thing I would just call out is, you know, again, just a few more ads in the back, but nothing too crazy compared to most magazines. And, I mean, again, I appreciate their cockiness that they didn't need advertising, but I kind of wonder if that's what did them in the end, is that they just didn't have the ad revenue of something like an EGM or Game Pro of the era. So that's a little bit about issue 1. We'll take a look at issue 2 next. And this one has a Virtua Fighter cover. Not really so much of a fan of this cover. I mean, again, it's just kind of showing the rendered art from the game, so it's not like a hand-drawn artwork like most of these other ones are. But, you know, again, Virtua Fighter 3 was big talk of the town, I guess, during this era, as that was about to launch. When you get to this issue, you will see the editor has changed. So it is Jason Thompson who edited the magazine from here on out. I actually looked him up to see what he was doing today, because I wasn't really familiar with him, but I liked his writing style in the magazine, and it sounds like he is still somewhat involved in the industry. He's been involved in creating artwork for tabletop games and things like that. Also worked in the anime industry for several years after the close of this magazine. I would say overall he wasn't as closely related to the video game side of the business, so maybe that's another reason why may not have been the best fit for a video game magazine. But overall, again, like I say, I like his writing style. It looks like he's still active in gaming-related industries as of 2021, so kind of nice to see. Then just kind of flipping forward, so some other things here. You have, again, some more content around kind of the state of the gaming industry. This really talks about the shift to 3D fighters. And so if you really think about this era, this is when Virtua Fighter 2 and 3 were starting to heat up, and then you also had things like Tekken 2 that were starting up. So it was kind of interesting to see like the state of the industry of fighting games and where it was going, because it had pretty much been all 2D up to that point. But as we saw, 2D lived on for much beyond that too. Another feature story in this one for the interview is a interview with somebody from Playmates USA that published Battle Arena Toshinden 2, a fighting game that really hasn't aged all that well. and overall I would say had very little involvement in the game to the US, so probably not the best interview for this issue. Obviously the cartoon serial continues on with this issue, so now you see some more characters from the Street Fighter universe joining the story. You have Guile as a big part of the comic from here on out, and some really nice flash pages in here and things like that. So I'll just kind of flip through a little bit of that for you. Kind of see what that looks like. It's a decent story. I mean, I've pretty much read through it. Probably skimmed a little bit here and there. And then the Samurai Showdown story continues on for the second half. So you can kind of see what's going on with that. Some more characters enter the universe here as well. And then, let's see what else here. Kind of moving toward the back of the magazine. You've got some previews and reviews again. And it covers some games that you probably typically wouldn't see in most magazines. You have a very early look at Resident Evil on the PlayStation, and they were pretty blown away by it, which understandably so. I think that was a pretty remarkable game for 1996. You have X-Men Children of the Atom, which was hitting the Sega Saturn in the US during that time. Pretty noteworthy game. Project Horned Owl, which is a big PS1 favorite of mine. I think that's a really neat game with a nice art style. And then they even covered things like Tales of Fantasia on Super Famicom, which never hit the US market. So kind of neat to see that included as well. But overall, magazine thickness is about the same. They didn't really deviate from that, and very heavy on the manga as far as what takes up the page count. So then we move on to issue 3. This is probably one of my favorites of the whole batch here. This is focused on SNK and really the history of SNK and their art style. Obviously it has a nice Harumaru cover on it as well, which ties in nicely to the manga inside. And you can kind of flip through and see where they went with the story on that. So nice splash page on SNK history here. Really just talking about how SNK, values art, probably more so than some of the gaming companies and what they brought to the table. And then what I thought was really neat was they had a little mini tour of SNK USA, which was located in Torrance, California at the time. There's a neat YouTube video out there, maybe I'll link it in the description, of some gamers from Europe that came to visit SNK USA during the period, probably about the same time that this magazine was written, and you can recognize that building in the video as well, but definitely recommend checking that out if you've never seen it. So again, some more things about SNK and kind of what makes them tick as far as their design. Moving forward, you have obviously your Cami cartoon continuing on. Excuse me, manga. I want to make sure I'm being proper. But, yep, the story continues with that. They did acknowledge in a couple places they did have to make some small edits to this. Apparently there was some nudity in some of these issues, so they had to make sure that they toned that down for the newsstands and things like that. Obviously the Samurai Showdown cartoon continues as well. And you see some other characters being added, so we have Hattori Hanzo joins, and a few more pages of that. That's pretty nice. And then toward the back of this issue, again, you get back into the few pages that they gave on reviews. I like this one. It has Panzer Dragoons 2, or Zwei, and then also Tokyo Highway Battle, which was the first game in the series we got in the US of the Shitoku Battle series, which I am a big fan of. So it was kind of interesting to read their take on this. Overall, I thought that it was a unique racing game, but a little bit bland, which I'd probably agree with that first entry in the series. It obviously got better from there. Another thing I would call out is one of the ads that you see in a lot of these issues was talking about the University of California at Irvine bookstore and how you could order manga, anime, and even Japanese video games through there. So I just thought that was pretty neat. I mean, when I was in college, you just got university sweatshirts. You didn't get to go buy Sega Saturn imports and things like that in the school bookstore. So kind of neat that they offered that even as a service. If they didn't have something in stock, you could order it directly through the school. So that'd be a nice perk of going to college there for sure during the period. So that's kind of a look at issue 3. We'll move on to issue 4. This one has a really great cover. I think, big fan of Final Fantasy VII, and I think it's a neat issue of Cloud with the Chocobo on there. So obviously the focus of this issue is on Squaresoft, and so it has quite a bit about Square over time. Again, letter from the editor, and then I just wanted to call out Some of the few game advertisements that it had were just very niche titles that probably didn't sell all that well. So here we have Robo Pit for the Sega Saturn and PS1 in the US by publisher Coco Pele, which I think was a subsidiary of THQ. So not exactly grade A titles that they were getting advertising dollars for. But then you get a nice story, cover story about the history of Square. I think they did a nice job just covering the history back to some of the early Famicom titles like Rad Racer and things like that we didn't even get here, like Final Fantasy II on the Famicom. And just going over some of the history of all that. There's a nice little list to the period of all the early Squaresoft games. And you can kind of see like all the different games besides RPGs that they put out early in their history. So that was kind of neat to see. This issue's interview was kind of funny. This was with Steve Gray, who was very short-lived as I think a VP of Squaresoft USA, which was just getting started during that time. Really, from reading this interview, the guy sounds like he doesn't really know anything about Japanese Squaresoft and RPGs and all that. He's kind of just like, I don't know, I just know sports games because I worked for EA before this, so cool, bro. I don't think he lasted long there. And obviously Square definitely improved their influence very quickly after this period. In the news section, you have, little news blurbs about even obscure consoles like the Bandai Pippin, whenever that first launched. That's kind of neat to see. And then this issue is strange in that the Cami manga takes a pause this issue, and there is just a Battle Arena Toshinden manga for this issue that really is just like a prequel to the story of the video game. But it only is just like a one-shot. There's nothing that goes beyond this. So I'm not a huge Toshinden fan, and maybe that's one of the reasons why they cut this one short. They put the Cami story on pause for this issue. So then we move on, and there is the continuation of the Samurai Showdown story. That one just kind of continues uninterrupted. I thought this was interesting. They had this section here on computer games that are manga influenced. So even kind of branching out beyond just console video gaming. Obviously the manga continues on. And then just one other thing to call out with this issue is a really neat 2-page story on Project Horned Owl, focusing on the art. And also they had a contest. And so by entering the contest, you could win Konami Justifier, you could win a mouse, and then obviously copies of Project Horned Owl. And just again, the game has great artwork. I know it's in 3D in the game, but the character design in the game is great. I've always been a fan of this game. I think it flies under the radar. And then you get some more game reviews. Again, just more obscure titles. Floating Runner for the PS1, as well as the second Kyo game that was Sega Saturn Japanese exclusive. So they even covered some imports in here besides just what we got on our shelves. It's kind of neat. So it's a pretty good issue. Issue 5 is my most recent acquisition. This was the hardest one for me to find. I don't know if it's because it's a Nintendo cover. Maybe more people are hanging on to it. I do think it's worth mentioning that, game magazines of this era typically did not have Nintendo characters on the cover. And this one obviously has a Super Mario 64 cover. Nintendo was pretty closely guarding of their assets, and obviously they had their own magazine, Nintendo Power, so they didn't necessarily feel the need that other magazines should feature their characters on the cover, with a few exceptions. So I do think that's kind of neat, just the pull of this small magazine that they were able to get this issue out there with a Mario cover. So kind of interesting. It has some pieces about Nintendo history and, what led to the Mario franchise. No main surprises there. Probably the most noteworthy section of this issue, though, is the interview with Howard Lincoln. And this was while the N64 was on one of its eternal delays and before it actually hit the U.S. market. Howard Lincoln is incredibly cocky in this interview, and I guess I've seen that sometimes in how he presents himself, but especially so here, just, saying that U.S. audiences are going to lap up $80 cartridges like no big deal because this is the Cadillac of consoles, and the competition is the Chevrolet of consoles. So, pinkies up, I guess, if you're a Nintendo game player, is what they were going for. Kind of a strange strategy, because I think, if you look at like the Wii, it was more about how can everybody get into the Wii. So very different. This issue is where our Cami manga continues. So it picks up the story right back from issue 3, I guess it was, and continues on for several pages. And then just kind of moving along, there is a neat little blurb in this issue about fanzines, which I do think is kind of interesting. Some of the writing in here almost feels like it would belong in a fanzine, so I guess it's kind of appropriate that they were reading some of these themselves. A couple of these I wanted to call out is Video Zone, which was written by Chris Kohler. Chris Kohler is still very active in the game industry today. So I'd never heard of his fanzine before, but I kind of would like to find some of those if I could. And then also Digital Press, which became a very popular website for classic gaming. It still exists today as far as I know. But it was born out of the fanzine, so kind of neat that has that. Also talks about one that was written for role-playing games called Roll Call. I never saw that one either, but interesting to read about those, something I wouldn't know about otherwise. Then we get back into the Samurai Showdown story. Again, just a continuation of that. Goes on for quite a few pages. And in the back of this one, just wanted to call out that you do have a review of Mario 64, which again was kind of early to see that. This was before the game launched in the US. And then at the bottom of each review is a bio of the writer. Their writers shifted all the time. There wasn't like a standard group of people who wrote their reviews. And kind of the theme I see with most of these is they were like college students who are just freelancing for them. So probably didn't need like real great game industry credentials just to be able to write for this magazine, which is kind of neat. You know, you get a little bit different, fresher perspective from college students. So get a few reviews in here, Suikoden, things like that. All right, so that's issue 5. We'll take a look at issue 6. Kind of strange, we're right back to another Virtua Fighter cover. We already had a Virtua Fighter cover on issue 2. So again, not really a huge fan of this cover, just kind of shows some computer-generated art. May have been more exciting in the era than it is now. And just kind of looking here, there's an interesting ad from some of the early SNK games that were brought out to the PS1. So you had Samurai Showdown 3 and King of Fighters 95. It sort of shows the SNK Big Red cabinets, but they're blacked out on the sides, I guess, for copyright reasons. I don't know. But the other thing that's weird about these is that SNK did not publish these games in the US. They were actually published by Sony, Computer Entertainment. So Sony actually put out this ad themselves. Maybe they were just trying to compete with the Saturn because, you know, you had a lot of fighting games on the Saturn, just making sure that they had some that they were bringing to the table too. Let's see, what else? This issue, since it's talking about Virtua Fighter, has a great interview with Yu Suzuki. I think that's pretty neat. I always like hearing his perspective. And kind of nice, actually. They talked to him for about 3 pages, so a little more in-depth than what you got with most of the interviews. Let's see, what else here? Again, some more arcade coverage. Get to read about Puzzle Fighter before it hit consoles, as well as Dynamite Cop. So just kind of unique to read about some of those titles early in the day. Again, our Cami Manga continues. Some more with the story on that. And more and more and more. The other thing that was kind of interesting is it took until issue 5 until they had a fan letter column for people to interact with the magazine, give their recommendations, things like that. I always like the fan letter sections. I think typically those age well too, just to see like what the pulse of the gaming buyer was, to see what kind of things they liked about these magazines and things like that. You also notice they have some fan art, so you have a Rare here, Samurai Showdown, and then not sure what that one is. It's kind of hard to tell. But regardless, you know, they were trying to bring a little bit more audience interaction by this issue, which is kind of nice. And they had a fan art contest and things like that, too. Back to the Samurai Showdown manga. Several more pages of that. And then some reviews. So some pretty cool titles that I like. Saturn Bomberman, as well as Motor Tune Grand Prix for the PS1. So, again, not real heavy on game content this issue, but some nice stuff overall. And then the last issue was issue 7. Obviously, the magazine didn't even make it out of 1996, so unfortunately it was very short-lived, but I do think that they did a nice job presenting the last issue. This one's about Tobal number 1, and really just a deep dive into Dream Factory, which was the subsidiary of Squaresoft that put it together, and it had that Akira art in it, too, that was pretty well known. I don't really think the game is that well, I don't know, I guess that played today, but it was neat that it existed at the time. I remember there's a lot of hype around it. So this final issue, you do get another letter from Jason Thompson. What's kind of interesting about this is he actually does acknowledge that this is going to be the last issue of the magazine and encourages the fans to join them on their website, which is jpop.com, Game On USA. So I don't know how long that lasted beyond the magazine, but that was kind of the intention, that this would become a virtual environment and still an arm of Viz Communications, so that they could focus on the video game market in addition to all the other Japan-centric stuff that they were doing through the jpop.com. So I don't know if any of my fans read that back in the day. I'd be curious to know like what was put on the website about Game On USA, and maybe how much longer that continued, if at all. So then this obviously has a focus on Dream Factory, talking about Tobal #1, and then also just kind of the company itself, and some focus on Akira Toriyama, all the Dragon Ball stuff that he was responsible for artwork, and then also even a list of all the games that featured Dragon Ball characters and Dragon Quest. It's kind of neat to see. And then we get into some arcade news. Again, some pretty obscure titles. So you have Red Earth, or Warzard, which is a Capcom fighter that was kind of a one-off. Didn't really get a lot of sequels. And then this one I thought was neat was Solar Assault. You hardly ever hear about this title. It was a rail shooter that was based on the Gradius universe. And I did get a US release, but I certainly never saw one back in the day. So I don't think there's a console version of that either. So what else? We have, of course, our Cami Manga. This one actually does wrap up the storyline for this, so it's kind of nice that, even though the magazine only lasted 7 issues, 6 of them had the Cami story. That's as long as it was in the first place, so it's not like it left you hanging. So if you invested time in reading them all, at least you get some closure. It's kind of nice to see. And then here's kind of the last page of that, and the end, and so on, so forth. So at least it covers all that. Let's see. Then we get back into our Samurai Showdown story. This one basically wraps up this issue as well. It does say to be continued kind of in the game storyline, so I'm sure that's how it was written in the first place. But at least it kind of gives you some closure for that. And you got a nice splash page at the end just wrapping it up. And it says, watch for the thrilling conclusion in the Samurai Showdown graphic novel coming in 1997. So I guess that's what you had to buy if you wanted to keep reading about it. This was neat. This was kind of buried in the back of this issue. It wasn't like a main focus interview, but there's an additional interview in this issue with a member of Working Designs, and just talking about Magic Knight Rayearth. A couple things were interesting about that. Number one, it's not an interview with Vic Ireland, who typically was the face of the company for the public interviews. It was a member of the team, I think it says named Kelly, but it doesn't even give their full name, so who knows who Kelly was. But Kelly talks about Magic Knight Rayearth, which was a pretty exciting title coming to the Saturn. This was 1996, and then if you really think about all the delays that game had, it didn't even hit the market until like May 1998 in the US, so definitely one of the reasons Working Designs had that reputation for delays. You have some more reviews here. You have X-Men vs. Street Fighter, as well as Dark Savior, Street Fighter Alpha 2, and then Tecmo's Deception. So it's pretty unique titles that may not have gotten as much coverage, or at least not full pages in some of the other magazines at the time. So overall, I guess my thoughts is these were pretty good magazines. I mean, I wish there was maybe a little bit less of the manga and more of the game-related stuff, because I think they wrote about it pretty well and with a good passion. Is this a top-tier magazine you must track down? Probably not. But if you like collecting old game magazines like I do, I think it's worth a look for sure. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of insight in the magazine. If anyone did buy these back in the day, I would love to hear kind of what your thoughts were in period, and, were you a fan of this? Did you subscribe to it? Things like that. The other thing I would say is if you want to track these down, you may have better luck buying them from comic book stores than trying to find them through eBay and video game type places. It seems like most of the ones I bought that came from online sellers were primarily comic book dealers, so maybe that's where many of these were distributed in the first place. So well worth taking a look if you're interested in picking up some of these. I think they're pretty fun reads. But that about does it for the first episode of this. I'm looking forward to making a few more in this series as I complete some more sets of my classic magazines, and you can give me some feedback if this is something you enjoyed as well. So thank you very much for watching. Please take a moment, like, comment, subscribe, let me know what you think, and I will talk to you soon. Have a great day or night, wherever you are.